What surprisingly causes stomach ulcer? In 1983, an enterprising Australian doctor named Barry Marshall decided to take a risk. Too many of these patients were complaining about severe abdominal pain due to stomach ulcers, which are sores in the lining of upper intestinal tract. At the time, few effective treatments for ulcer existed, and many suffering required hospitalization or even surgery. Desperate for answer, Dr. Marshall saw a cloudy broth of bacteria collected from the stomach of one of his patients. Soon, Dr. Marshall was experiencing the same abdominal pain, bloating, and vomiting. 10 days later, a camera called an endoscope peered inside his inside. Marshall's stomach was steaming with the same bacteria as his patient. He also developed gastritis, or severe inflammation of stomach, the hallmark precursor of ulcers. Dr. Marshall's idea challenges a misconception that still persists to this day, that ulcers are caused by stress, food, or too much stomach acid. Marshall thought the culprit was bacterial infections. Initially, his idea was considered crazy by the applied medical mind on the planet. But in 2005, he and Dr. Robin Warming received the ultimate validation when it was the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Our stomachs are J-shaped organs with surprisingly intricate ecosystems awash in hormones and chemicals. The stomach is under constant attacks by digestion anxiety, bile, proteins, microbes, and the stomach's own acid. In response, it produces bicarbonates, mucus, and the phospholipids called prostaglandins to maintain the integrity of its own lining. This delicate balance is constantly regulated and referred to as mucosal defense. Since the mid-1800s, doctors thought stress alone caused the most stomach ulcers. Patients were given antidepressants or tranquilizers and told to visit health spa. This belief eventually shifted to the released notion of spicy food and stress as culprits. Yet no convincing study has ever demonstrated that emotional upset, psychological distress, or spicy food directly causes ulcer disease. By the mid-20th century, it was widely accepted that excess hydrochloric acid prompts the stomach to eat itself. Fervent promoters of this idea were referred to as the acid mafia. The biggest hole in this theory was the antacids only provides temporary relief. We now know that some rare ulcers are indeed caused by too much hydrochloric acid, but they make up less than 1% of all cases. Dr. Marshall and Dr. Warren pinpoint the spider-shaped bacteria called the Helicobacter pylori or H. pylori as the real offender. H. pylori is one of the humanity's oldest and most frequent companions, having joined us at least 50,000 years ago and now found in 15% of people. Previously, we thought the stomach was sterile on account of being such an acidic, hostile environment. Yet H. pylori survived the acidic terminus of stomach with a variety of features that disrupt mucofans in its favor. For example, it produces an enzyme called urease, but helps protect it from the surrounding gastric acid. H. pylori can make over 1,500 proteins, many of which are dedicated to maximize its variance. We still have unanswered questions like why specific people develop ulcers at particular times. However, we do know individual genetics, other medical problems, use of drug medications, smoking, and the genetic diversity of Helicobacter strains all play a role. In particular, certain pain medications used to reduce inflammation in joints have been discovered to work with H. pylori to create more severe stomach ulcers. Dr. Marshall ended up being bored after his famous, albeit dangerous, experiment. he ingested a course of antibiotics similar to the one taken now for ulcers. To be treated by simple antibiotics is modern triumph for a disease that previously needed surgery. Marshall's work also reminds us that scientific progress is not always smooth, but there is value in trusting your provider and sometimes literal gut. Did you enjoy these lessons? What more? In 1984, an enterprising Australian doctor named Barry Marshall decided to take a risk. Too many of his patients were complaining of severe abdominal pain due to stomach ulcers, which are sores in the lining of upper intestinal tract. At the time, few effective treatments for ulcers existed, and many sufferers required hospitalization or even surgery. Desperate for answers, Dr. Marshall swallowed a cloudy broth of bacteria collected from the stomach of one of his patients. Soon, Dr. Marshall was experiencing the same abdominal pain, bloating, and vomiting. 10 days later, a camera called an endoscope peered inside his insides. Marshall's stomach was teeming with the same bacteria as his patient. He also developed gastritis, or severe inflammation of the stomach, the hallmark precursor of ulcers. Dr. Marshall's idea challenges a misconception that still persists to this day, that ulcers are caused by stress, food, or too much stomach acid. Marshall thought the culprit was bacterial infections. Initially, his idea was considered crazy by the plainest medical mind on the planet. But in 2005, he and Dr. Robin Warren received the ultimate validation when it was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Our stomachs are J-shaped organs with surprisingly intricate ecosystems awash in hormones and chemicals. The stomach is under constant attack by digestive anxiety, bile, proteins, microbes, and the stomach's own acid. In response, it produces bicarbonates, mucus, and phospholipids called prostaglandins to maintain the integrity of its own lining. This delicate balance is constantly regulated and referred to as mucosal defense. Since the mid-1800s, doctors thought stress alone caused the most stomach ulcers. Patients were given antidepressants or tranquilizers and told to visit a healthy spot. This belief eventually shifted to related notion of spicy foods and the stress as culprits. Yet no convincing study has ever demonstrated that emotional upset, psychological distress, or spicy food directly causes ulcer disease. By the mid-20th century, it was widely accepted that excess hydrochloric acid prompts the stomach to eat itself. Fervent proponents of this idea were referred to as the acid mafia. The biggest hole in the theory was the antacids only provide a temporary relief. We now know that some rare ulcers are indeed caused by too much hydrochloric acid, but they make up less than 1% of all cases. Dr. Marshall and Dr. Warren pinpointed spider-shaped bacteria called Helicobacter pylori or H. pylori as the real offender. H. pylori is one of the humanity's oldest and most frequent companions, having joined us at least 50,000 years ago and now found in 15% of people. Previously, we thought the stomach was sterile on account of such an acidic, hostile environment. Yet H. pylori survived the excess turmoil of stomach with a variety of features that disrupts mucosal fans in its favor. For example, it produces an enzyme called urease, but helps protect it from the surrounding gastric acid. H. pylori can make over 1,500 proteins, many of which are dedicated to maximize its burden. We still have unanswered questions, like why specific people develop ulcers at particular times. However, we do know individual genetics are medical problems, use of certain medications, smoking, and genetic diversity of Helicobacter strains all play a role. In particular, certain pain medications used to reduce inflammation in joints have been discovered to work with H. pylori to create more severe stomach ulcers. Dr. Marshall ends up being fine after his famous, albeit dangerous, experiment. He ingests a course of antibiotics similar to the one taken now for ulcers. To be treated by simple antibiotics is a modern triumph for a disease that previously needed surgery. Marshall's work also reminds us that the scientific progress is not always smooth, but there is value in trusting your proverbial and sometimes literary gut. Did you enjoy these lessons? If so, please consider supporting our nonprofit mission by visiting patreon.com/TED.